Doom: The Dark Ages has officially come out, and you would think the game would have blown the doors off the hinges and completely taken over the industry by now. Instead, the release of Dark Ages has resoundingly been met with a far more muted response than expected. And the question now is why? What happened? Are players rejecting this game? Did the boycott of fans demanding id Software not include things like de novo actually affect the sales, or is it something else? Let's dive into it. Firstly, the game reviewed well, and I have officially beat the whole game myself and got the Platinum Trophy for Dark Ages. Overall, I thought the game was good, but not amazing. On paper, it has many concepts that I do love in games: dragons, cosmic gods, and heavy metal music. But I think what Dark Ages promised versus what it delivered was a far safer and by-the-numbers experience than players likely anticipated. There's also the question of value that Dark Ages provides versus those of previous Doom games. Doom 2016 launched with a full campaign as well as a multiplayer mode that allowed players to fight one another, as well as the snap map feature, which allowed players to make their own levels and then upload them like in Halo 3 with Forge so that other players could play them. This led to a longevity for Doom 2016, and it always helped that it was the first game of its kind to have this new modern Doom way of playing and doing things, where it's become so iconic that plenty of other games like Proteus, Ultra Kill, and even Rage 2 are all pretty much just homages or straight rip-offs of Doom 2016. Then you had Doom Eternal, which in my opinion is probably the most complete experience of what this modern Doom trilogy has felt like so far. It was like Doom 2016 but on crack. You could dash around, rip and tear, and like Doom 2016, Eternal also has a multiplayer mode called Battle Mode instead this time, which allowed one player to play the Slayer, and then everyone else were demons, and you had to, end each other pretty much. While not the best online mode ever made, it was at least something besides the campaign. And then you get to Dark Ages, which has a campaign, and well, that's it. There's nothing else. There's no other modes that exist at launch besides that main campaign, which had me confused as to what was the plan here from the beginning with Dark Ages versus the more robust previous offerings. Don't get me wrong, okay? Dark Ages campaign is good, even great at times. I found the dragon flying mission early on when you're taking down the fortress to be a particular highlight of the game. And there's some boss battles especially that felt really good to play against, but when you compare what Dark Ages offers to the previous two games in its trilogy, it simply may not have been enough for most players to buy into, at least outside of Xbox anyways. Of course, Dark Ages is available on Game Pass day one. id Software is now also owned by Microsoft, so that was a given that it was going to happen. And obviously, because of that, Xbox players have no real reason to buy the game outright. So id Software and Microsoft would instead need to rely on PlayStation 5 and Steam players to pick up the slack to support the franchise instead. And looking at the numbers, well, it's surprisingly not looking great, and it's kind of confusing actually. Here's an article titled, Doom: The Dark Ages launches with lowest Steam player count in modern trilogy, and when you look at the numbers, it's even more brutal. Firstly, let's look at Doom 2016 Steam numbers, which hit a concurrent player count as seen here of 44,000 players at its peak. A reminder, this game is now 9 years old as of this video going live anyways. So while that number may seem low Steam-wise these days, but remember that gaming was much smaller back then compared to it is now. So this is actually a very healthy number, and obviously we know that Doom 2016 did well enough to obviously warrant a sequel and then some. I couldn't find exact concrete numbers on how much Doom 2016 sold specifically, but from what I gathered online, it sold somewhere between 5 to maybe 5.5 million copies, with some estimates claiming that it has breached the 6 million mark and then some, but again, I can't confirm any of that myself. Regardless, for a single player game released in 2016 when stuff like Battle Royales hadn't already taken over literally everything by that point, 5 to 6 million units plus for your modern Doom game is healthy, and id Software clearly made a hit. Then with Eternal, the numbers speak for themselves as seen here from Game World Observer back in 2020 when Eternal first launched. The game was confirmed to have surpassed all previous Doom titles in the franchise upon release, and Eternal did so well actually, it doubled the revenue and profits of Doom 2016. Although exact copies sold, again, I'm unable to find any concrete info on that one either. Regardless, Eternal did very well for id Software, while some had problems with the game. Generally speaking, the game was a complete experience, and it reiterated on what modern Doom was going for, and like I said, these two Doom games pretty much revolutionized the boomer shooter genre and and revitalized it and led to many clone-like games being made. A good comparison actually is From Software. What modern Doom did with its gameplay and style and movement is very similar to how From Software's Demon's Souls, Dark Souls, and even Elden Rings and all of those did when it came to dungeon crawling RPGs. As we know, the term Souls-like or Soulsborne is pretty much everywhere now. There's plenty of games inspired by From Software's design releasing every other month now, it seems. So it's clear that Doom's reboot was very influential in a very similar fashion, and that's good for id Software. And looking at Eternal Steam chart numbers as seen here, Eternal more than doubled 2016's game and then some on Steam alone. Some reports even claim that Eternal made id Software roughly $450 million in revenue within its first year or two of release, which is amazing. The game also received 2 expansions, which were called the Ancient Gods Part 1 and 2, and overall Eternal was, by all intents and purposes, it was the complete package for what a Doom player would want to see from this franchise pretty much in the modern age. This then brings us to Dark Ages, and when you look at its Steam charts, the numbers are, well, they're concerning to say the least. Here's Dark Ages Steam chart numbers, which peaked at just 31,470 players, and mind you, this chart is currently displaying Dark Ages player numbers during its opening weekend. As this article here says, which is titled, Doom the Dark Ages achieved only 29% of Eternal Steam launch player count. It does paint a bleak picture for Dark Ages when you compare how it's performing versus that of the previous 2 games. If we think about it though, Doom 2016, that launched at a perfect time. Like I said, Battle Royale live service slop was present during this time, but it was nowhere near the level that it's operating at these days. Games like Fortnite right now offer entirely unique experiences for free. Battle Royale, racing cars, Rock Band pretty much, not to mention Ballistic and all the other unique modes players can make. You even got Lego and then some. I know someone will say, but why are you comparing Fortnite to Doom? They're 2 different audiences, but these days, most AAA offerings, they do tend to overlap. And Doom 2016 came out when those sorts of games were expected to be what they were at that time. People weren't as normalized to free to play like they are now, and then switching to Eternal, it too had its own perfect storm as well. Eternal released during the COVID pandemic. People were inside, frustrated, angry, and just, mad at the world. Who can blame them? And then here came a game where they could rip and tear demons apart and shoot stuff to blow off steam, and people were inside obviously with literally nowhere to go. So naturally, people wanted escapism during this time period, and Eternal was the panacea to the bleakness of the world that was around them. And we also need to remember that both Doom 2016 and Eternal were cheaper than games are now too. And when we look at Dark Ages, it proves that maybe the industry's push for full price games these days is not going to go as they initially planned. Remember that Microsoft and Nintendo do want to raise prices this fall, meaning that Dark Ages at full price now will be cheaper than it will be this fall when it goes at, even more money at full price. But if the numbers we're getting now exist, what hope does it have then? It'll obviously be discounted if this trajectory continues the way that it's going before long. But I know others will say, well, Dark Ages is on Game Pass, therefore that's why people aren't paying for it the same way. And let's actually look into that for a second, because Doom 2016, that came out a full year before Xbox Game Pass even existed yet. And at the time, Microsoft also did not own id Software either. And when Eternal came out, it did come to Game Pass. However, it did not release day one on Game Pass, but instead it was actually 7 months after its initial release is when it finally landed on Game Pass to play. With Dark Ages, however, it is the first of this trilogy that was day and date on Game Pass, which means this is the first time a Doom game has released on it, and clearly it has changed things. Because another thing that I noticed was that Dark Ages is technically the first fully produced in-house Doom game under Microsoft's wing, whereas Eternal was in development long before Microsoft had actually acquired id Software, and what Dark Ages represented to me was this very safe, almost by the numbers in some instances kind of experience when compared to the previous two games. And something kept creeping into my head as I played the game, which is maybe Dark Ages was made with a similar vision as, say, the same way Avowed or the more recent Halo games were too, which is that these games, now all under Microsoft, just needed to be good enough to release on Game Pass, and that's really it. Look, I'm not saying that Dark Ages is a bad game. It reviewed similarly in the mid to high 80s like the other two games did, but having played it fully, it is also far easier than, say, Eternal, and like I said, it launched with less modes than the previous two games too. And I do think that Dark Ages should have at least opted for an optional game mode. The idea that comes to my mind is a roguelite game mode, probably. Something similar similar to what God of War Ragnarok added post-launch, which allowed Kratos to run through a Hades-style game mode, fighting monsters while getting story bits of info along the way, and then if you died, you would restart and get new upgrades, that sort of thing. And Doom obviously already has a strong responsive gameplay loop, and this would just make sense to add. Or another equally interesting game mode would have been perhaps a Space Marine 2-like operations game mode instead, where players could team up as slayers or whatever else and then hunt demons together and level up and upgrade their weapons in an RPG-light scenario to customize their slayers. But again, none of this exists in Dark Ages, it's just 22 main missions and that's it. Arguably though, it then begs the question if id Software may have to some degree phoned this game in somewhat, because there's probably not much fear, I guess, of mass layoffs on performance when it comes to Dark Ages compared to the previous games. Obviously, Doom 2016 and Eternal initially required more modes and pizzazz, if you will, because there was tangible realities being formed that, let's say if Doom 2016 flopped out of the gate, yeah, id Software would have been facing mass layoffs. And Eternal was also created with that same sort of vision in mind. Obviously, halfway through development, id Software got bought by Microsoft, but the blueprint, design, and vision were already set in stone at that point. With Dark Ages, well, their bills are already paid for. id Software can, in theory, just coast on by and kind of just, make whatever they want, which is likely why they didn't feel the need to add more game modes, because regardless of the performance of the game, they'll still be here and they'll probably be fine. And I'm sure performance matters to a degree, and I wager that Dark Ages is doing great on Game Pass already, sure, but it is also a completely different scenario to what id Software is used to operating within, and we all know, despite games releasing on Game Pass, that they can and do still perform well outside of those services, well, some of them anyways. A good recent example is Oblivion Remastered. Here's that game's Steam chart as you can see here on screen. Oblivion peaked at 216,000 players on Steam, and currently, as of this video going live, has more players on Steam than Dark Ages does, despite it being almost a month old now. To add more proof to what's going on, let's look at yet another game that also launched on Game Pass day one that's doing insanely well outside of it, which is Clair Obscur Expedition 33. That game sold over 2 million copies so far, and let's look at its Steam chart too. And as you can see, Clair Obscur hit almost 145,000 players on Steam despite Game Pass having it as well. And it still has just over 100,000 players as of this video coming out, and it's been about a week and a bit away from being available, to buy for about 1 month almost. So why are Oblivion and Clair Obscur doing so well despite Game Pass day one releases, but Dark Ages isn't doing nearly as hot? Well, there's another big reason, which is, of course, the price of these games. Oblivion Remastered launched at $50 American and comes with the entirety of Cyrodiil to explore alongside 2 whole feature-complete expansions, all remastered and rendered in beautiful graphics, well, despite the citizens still looking weird, but hey, that's Oblivion's charm, I guess. But regardless, the game was not a full-price game, yet despite that, Oblivion gave what can only be described as offering more content than most fully priced premium titles these days anyways. Then Clair Obscur launched at the same price point of $50 American, and having 100% of that game myself and platinumed it, I can confidently say that Clair Obscur more than justifies its asking price, and Clair Obscur also took me like 93 hours to platinum. I got everyone to level 99, I did everything, I really enjoyed that game. I also thought it had easily one of the best turn-based combat systems of all time. But again, both of these games launched at well below the price points of what is considered premium these days. Now with Dark Ages, it launched at $70 American, yet despite it launching at a premium price point, again, reminder, they will jack the price up this fall when Microsoft increases all of their pricings too, that Dark Ages launched with less modes and with a far easier game to boot. The shield in Dark Ages pretty much trivializes a lot of the enemy attacks too, since you can safely block basically anything you want that you can't get out of the way of. And the shield has a resistance meter, so it can really block anything to a certain point before kind of, blocking and getting pushed away to the side, I guess. Which of course, if you're not good at Doom, and hey, I'm not claiming I'm some god at it either, but if even I can completely dominate Dark Ages hordes of demons and then some, there's probably an argument to be made that Dark Ages simplified the core gameplay loop a little too much for some people. Don't get me wrong though, I really did enjoy Dark Ages combat. I also really enjoyed flying the dragon too. However, the big robot fights, which are cool, were unfortunately also taking up entire levels at times to play through, and with already only 22 missions available, I would rather not have those robot missions, and I kind of just wanted more intricate level design to run around in and play Doom as Doom is, It just maybe feels like that Dark Ages underperformance as far as it looks so far is due to a huge variety of factors against it. It costs premium premium pricing yet doesn't offer the same level of content as the previous games. It's also being released not just on Game Pass, but in the marketplace in general during a very crowded time period. Oblivion will definitely be a game that players are still playing since it is a big game, and Clair Obscur 2 is also pretty huge for what it is as well. And both of these games offer more content for less money, whereas Dark Ages took me maybe 20 hours at best to beat in 100%. And hey, look, I'm all for shorter games. I don't personally mind that Doom the Dark Ages was shorter myself, but I guess it's becoming clear that the rest of the marketplace may not be thinking the same way as me. And I should also state that Dark Ages did top the Steam Global Sellers list when it did release, so the game is obviously still being bought, and players, even if the Steam numbers aren't the best, are playing it. However, it is concerning when stuff like Stellar Blade, which is a year-old PlayStation exclusive, is now coming to PC soon as well. And as you can see here, Stellar Blade is currently outselling Dark Ages on Steam despite it not being out till June 2025. And hey, I get it, man. I beat Stellar Blade when it came out. I love that game. It took me somewhere in the maybe 40 to 50 hour mark probably to fully platinum the game. And I felt like what I played of Stellar Blade more than justified its price point to me, and I have no doubt that when Stellar Blade releases on Steam, it will be probably a massive success on that platform too. I expect at least 50,000 concurrent players at the very least. Wouldn't even be surprised if it hit 100,000 actually. But it's weird how Dark Ages, which should have had a similar Steam player count to Eternal at least, instead regressed so poorly like this. You would think that your third game would have more, not 1/3 what your previous game achieved in the same time frame. But maybe the industry is just vastly overestimating what people are willing to buy when it comes to the price hikes and how the whole hobby is going. And then there's this from Games Radar Plus, and it's titled, "Former PlayStation executive says $70 or $80 games are a steal. As long as people choose carefully how they spend their money, I don't think they should be complaining." So this comes from Shuhei Yoshida, who worked with PlayStation for decades and recently retired. The guy has been there since the beginning, and since then he has been vibing in his retirement and just doing interviews because, I mean, why not, right? But his message here feels at odds with what players want these days. Claiming that $80 or $90 a game is a steal is not exactly a luxury that most people have as an objective reality these days, because the majority of people are maybe 1 or 2 paychecks away from becoming homeless, which is terrible but sadly true for many people. And games were already, in my opinion, too expensive at the best of times, with most new releases not really justifying their price points at all. Because $70 American, which equates to like $90 Canadian for me, that's a lot to ask for your new game. And with this whole price hike coming into effect, it means that brand new games will be launching for upwards of $110 to $130 Canadian a pop over here. And Canadians are already dealing with high inflation rates and terrible housing costs, not to mention food that just keeps getting more expensive too. Look, I like Shuhei Yoshida, but I do think the guy is not speaking from an ordinary person perspective here, but that of a privileged executive instead. The guy has likely not had to buy many of the games that he plays. He was a PlayStation executive, for God's sakes. He likely could just pick up a phone and tell someone to generate him a code for any game on PlayStation that he wanted to play, and they would do it because he's their boss, obviously, or I guess was now. But whatever, the point still stands. Shuhei Yoshida hasn't really needed to buy games to a similar degree as you or me have in the past. And the reality is not everyone is living clearly off the salary of a top PlayStation executive, where he might think it's a steal to others, it's stealing already, as in robbery from their wallets. By the way, this interview was conducted by Critical Hit Games, and here's what Shuhei said as it reads here. "When you look at life in general, other products in price have increased, way more than the game price, so I think it was almost too late for the video game companies to start looking at the pricing structure." I can see where Shuhei is going with this, but this argument is still moot because you can't compare the inflated pricing of entertainment and then justifiably place it against things people need to continue living. It's not a fair comparison to say Doom the Dark Ages costing $70 or I guess $80 or $90 later this year is totally fine because your chicken breast is more expensive now too, or comparing Dark Ages pricing to say your water bill or your rent or your car payment. These are things people need to actually live. And Dark Ages, like any other game, movie, or show, are entertainment. They are not necessarily necessary for the continuation of one's life. Is it nice to have new games to play? I mean, yeah, of course it is. But if it comes down to whether you should buy Dark Ages day one or have to pay your rent so you don't, I don't know, end up homeless or put food on your table, the answer is obviously simple for most people. And the reality is that I believe a lot of these executives and journalists, both of whom get free access to the media they speak on and never really have to open their wallets for games outside of the very few rare circumstances where that might happen, are clearly speaking from a privileged position here. And I think the reaction to Dark Ages and the lack of support it's getting from fans, that it tells a much different story than what Shuhei and the rest are trying to push as the objective reality. Again, no shade at Shuhei Yoshida. He's entitled to his opinion, but I don't agree with him on this one at all. Shuhei continues where he also says this: "I don't believe that every game has to be priced priced the same. Each game has different value it provides or the size of budget. I totally believe that it's up to the publisher or developer self-publishing decision to price their product to the value that they believe they are bringing in. This is true, and like I showed you with Oblivion Remastered and Clair Obscur as well, I think it's very obvious unless your fully priced premium game is something akin to Baldur's Gate 3 or something like that, the likelihood that your game succeeds at that price point is very minimal at best these days. And the games doing the best right now are far cheaper than these premium offerings, and Dark Ages, in my opinion, should have sold at best $60 American base price, not $70. Especially when, like I said, it released in a crowded time and there's better games for cheaper that last longer too. And here's what one user said in that Games Radar Plus article about Shuhei Yoshida. Here's what they said. Says a millionaire, the issue with the prices is we get incomplete games. If I'm gonna pay $80 for a game, then there better not ever be any updates or season pass or expansion packs I still have to download or pay for. I better get 100% of the game on day one. Don't sell me half the game for $80, then in a year make me buy a $40 expansion pack. And that's really what happens most of the time, isn't it? A lot of games launch these days buggy. Even Dark Ages has problems too. A lot of people can't unlock the Berserker trophy, which requires you to upgrade everything because the game glitches out, stopping them from the Platinum trophy. Thankfully, somehow I didn't get that bug, but it's very prevalent all over from what I've been reading prior to playing the game. I was actually dreading that trophy not popping as I played it, so when it did, I kind of just put my arms up in the air and went, oh, it worked for me. That's weird. But it's kind of sad that I was surprised about it, isn't it? Because if I paid full price, shouldn't the trophy just work as intended anyways? Why is something like that bugged to begin with? I've said this before, but what Shuhei doesn't bring up is that video games are uniquely one of the only products that I can think of where you're expected to pay 100% of the product, yet usually you don't really ever get 100% of the product up front too. In no other industry can I think this is something welcomed or normalized outside of gaming. Maybe real estate, I guess, because sometimes you gotta wait for the house to be built. Not the best comparison, but honestly, that's all I can really think of. Everything else, if you buy food or a car or a TV, it just works as intended, and if it doesn't, you return it as defective. Or if the food you buy is spoiled, you complain and you get a refund because, yeah, you're entitled to that. Yet with games, if you voice your discomfort that, hey, this game I bought for full price doesn't work, or maybe it lacks features, you're usually just called entitled, or in Shuhei's words here, we shouldn't be complaining if a game is more money than it used to be despite quality or lack of features. We should instead just be happy that the game exists at all, but again, you have to be very privileged to think this way about games. I think what we're actually seeing as a breaking point in what people are going to be willing to spend on games in the future. And I already know people will use the Nintendo Switch 2 launch and its expensive games as a gotcha and say, see, people are willing to spend more for games. But you're going to be comparing the launch of a new console with a diehard fan base that quite literally buys anything Nintendo makes to the average player out here that doesn't play Nintendo games. And the problem with Nintendo versus other game companies is that Nintendo has beaten the concept of pay up or shut up into their fan base for literal decades. Because Nintendo fans don't know what cheap games are from Nintendo means, because Nintendo never really reduces the prices of their core franchises games, if ever. At best, you'll get like $10 off on Zelda in maybe 3 years for like 2 days, and that's it. And if the rest of the industry thinks they can somehow force that behavior onto PC and PlayStation players to act like Nintendo fans do, I'm just gonna say it, man, they're in for a rude awakening. Because on the flip side, PC, especially those fans, have bought heavily discounted games for decades now. And you better have the next coming of Christ of a video game to convince these players to want to fork over $80 or $90 when they could take that same amount of money and go buy like 40 other games in total in bundles instead for that exact same price. And I think these companies are effing around and finding out here real quick that most consumers don't need to buy new games day one unless it's really, really good. Sure, okay, Grand Theft Auto 6 will sell well regardless of the price that it is, but you can't really compare GTA 6 to any other game really, because that's like comparing a Maserati to a Toyota. It ain't gonna happen. And the truth is that the industry is changing, and so too are the customers. And the way players have abandoned or boycotted or rejected Dark Ages shows that even if you come from an established franchise like this, that, you know, charging this full premium price point these days is just not going to justify most people to open their wallets no matter what you do, as one user said on Twitter. Turn Doom into Reddit Halo, series dies, they should have went biblical with the series instead of turning it into Rick and Morty mess. Imagine Doom Guy fighting alongside the Archangel Michael, wasted potential. Some users would reply, here's what one said, the people who hated Eternal for not being like 2016 are now mad at the Dark Ages for not being like Eternal. Yeah, it usually works like that, doesn't it? Of course, there was cope too, as this one user said, using Steam charts again when I assume most people just use Game Pass go cry about it, then this guy responded with, oh yeah? Well, heaps of us are renting it. Yeah, not the best argument there, is it? Well, at least something Doom is selling out. The McFarlane toy version of Doom, guys, you can see on screen here, is already sold out on their website, so I mean, there is interest, just doesn't seem to be translating in a way for the game at least. And we know had Doom already broken a milestone that id Software would announce announced it by now, because announcing Milestones usually hypes people up, and they get FOMO to check the game out to be a part of the conversation, but so far id Software is just radio silent. Has this game even broke 1 million in sales yet? This is unusually quiet of id Software to do, if you ask me. I mean, we know people will buy games if they deem it good enough, as seen here. I mean, Monster Hunter Wilds broke 10 million copies sold in just 2 months at retail. And yeah, that's a massive success, but Wilds is more than just a campaign. It has a massive, robust endgame too, which Dark Ages unfortunately has nothing like that, as Grump said here too. If Doom Dark Ages can't post AAA numbers, I begin to suspect the $70 price point for games is an inflection point. $80 to $100 later this year is going to be a very hard sell for most games, and I think we see that now. What it ultimately comes down to is this. I'm not saying that Dark Ages has problematic elements or panders, or you should boycott it. It doesn't have any of that stuff at all. But this just comes down to the fact that what they offered hasn't responded in the same degree, and players are looking for just, cheaper alternatives instead these days. It probably also doesn't help too that Dark Ages has de novo, and you can't turn off ray tracing on PC, which angered a lot of PC players whose PCs couldn't run ray tracing properly, which means they couldn't play the game even if they wanted to. Well, I'm not saying that Doom is dead or id Software is cooked yet anyways. I think this combination of premium price point, lack of features, Game Pass day one, and too many other just as good, if not even better experiences coming out that cost less also all pamper Dark Ages success. I do hope to see more Doom in the future myself. I think this franchise has a lot to offer still, but I think id Software needs to quickly pivot here and maybe start making more replayable Doom games in the future with more interesting modes than what was on offer here. Because when it comes to Dark Ages, there's nothing besides a skin or two to chase with higher difficulty modes once you beat the game. And besides that, there's nothing else to chase in this game at all, and that kind of sucks. I feel like I got my experience out of this game and that's it. And I have little reason to ever go back to it. I'm sure that Dark Ages will sell much more when it gets discounted, but at release right now, this may just prove that AAA gaming has some tough questions and decisions ahead of them that they don't want to answer or deal with. And maybe this mandatory price hike is probably not the best way to go about things, but did you play Dark Ages at release? What do you think of it, or did you avoid it because it's asking too much for what it's offering? Let me know in the comments, subscribe, like the video if you enjoyed it, and I'll see you guys in the next one.